In the mid-1970s, an Australian farmer named Peter Andrews bought a wrecked, salt-poisoned property in the Bylong Valley of New South Wales called Tarwyn Park, and told the agronomists advising him he was not going to clear the willows. He would not pull the reeds. He would not straighten the creek. He would not spray a single so-called weed choking the waterway that ran through his land. Every plant the government had spent decades telling farmers to destroy, he would let keep growing. Neighboring farmers thought he'd lost his mind. Government water authorities investigated him for what he was doing to a public waterway. For the next 30 years, almost no one in an official position believed a word he said. Nearly 50 years later, Tarwyn Park is cited in scientific reviews, taught in university courses, and studied by hydrologists from other countries. And the land that once could not grow grass without irrigation had, by his own account, stayed green through some of the worst droughts in Australian history. This is the story of Peter Andrews, the weeds everyone told him to kill, and the 30 years it took for anyone in authority to admit he might be right. The land Andrews walked onto in the mid-1970s was not just tired, it was actively poisoning itself. Cut into a deep, narrow gully, the kind that carries water off a property fast instead of letting it soak in. This was standard across the region. For 200 years, Australian farmers had been clearing native vegetation, draining wetlands, and straightening waterways on official advice to make land easier to farm. On Tarwyn Park, that advice had produced a paddock that turned to bare, cracked dirt every time the rain stopped. But Andrews had grown up on a station near Broken Hill, reading a landscape that had never been farmed the conventional way, and something about Tarwyn Park's dying creek didn't match what he'd seen there as a boy. He needed to know why. The answer turned out to be a piece of hydrology nobody had asked Australian farmers to think about. Before 2 centuries of clearing and draining, Andrews argued, Australian floodplains didn't move water in single, fast channels the way most of them do today. They spread it out across shallow, swampy systems he called chains of ponds, slow and braided, holding water on the land for months instead of rushing it out to sea in days. That slow spread is what kept the country green through drought. Straighten the channel, clear the banks, and the water that used to soak the land for a season now drains off in an afternoon, taking the topsoil with it. The willows and reeds growing wild along Tarwyn Park's creek were, in Andrews's view, doing exactly the job the landscape had lost. Their roots trapped sediment instead of letting it wash downstream. Their stems slowed the current instead of letting it dig the creek bed deeper. Left standing, reinforced with low banks, Andrews built by hand along the natural contour lines. They turned a fast, destructive gully back into something closer to the slow-spreading system he believed the land was built to hold. He built contour banks, redirected channels. Water that used to vanish downstream within hours started soaking into the ground beneath his own paddocks, recharging an aquifer that hadn't been fed properly in a century. The reaction was immediate, and it was not kind. Neighboring farmers worried that blocking and redirecting the creek would flood land downstream. Government water authorities, operating under rules that For close to 2 decades, nothing about that changed. Andrews kept building banks. He kept refusing to clear the willows. And Tarwyn Park kept quietly doing something the properties around it could not, producing pasture through drought conditions that were emptying paddocks across the region. It was his other life, standing thoroughbred stallions that got people paying attention. Andrews measured what was happening on his land the way a horseman measures anything, by results. Horses raised on Tarwyn Park's pasture were performing, by his account, in years when neighboring feed had failed outright. Word moved through agricultural circles the way it usually does, one skeptical visit at a time, until scientists, several with backgrounds at Australia's National Science Agency, CSIRO, came to look at what he'd actually built. Here the story has to be told fairly, because the science was never unanimous. Some researchers who examined Tarwyn Park found real, measurable evidence that the contour banks and standing vegetation were rehydrating the floodplain and cutting salinity, exactly as Andrews described. Other hydrologists were more cautious, arguing that what worked on one valley in the Upper Hunter had not been proven to generalize everywhere his supporters claimed it could. What nobody disputed was the property itself. Photographed and monitored for decades, it had gone from a salt-scarred paddock that broke in every dry year, to one that held water and pasture through conditions that broke farms nearby. That mixed but genuine credibility eventually reached people with the resources to test the idea at scale. Landholder Tony Coote partnered with Andrews to apply the same principle across Maloon Creek, further south in New South Wales, building a series of small, deliberately leaky structures across the waterway to slow and spread its flow, the way Tarwyn Park's willows and banks had. That partnership ran for years and grew into the Maloon Institute, an organization that has gone on monitoring rehydration results across an entire valley system, not just one farm, and has drawn support from scientists and landholders who once would have dismissed the whole idea outright. In January 2011, more than 3 decades after he refused to clear a single willow, Peter Andrews was awarded the Order of Australia Medal, one of the country's highest civilian honors, for his contribution to landscape restoration. The man 3 decades of water authorities had investigated was now being formally recognized by the same country that had spent 30 years telling him he was wrong. The story doesn't end on a clean note, and it shouldn't. In 2014, financial pressure forced the Andrews family to sell Tarwyn Park to a Korean energy company planning an open-cut coal mine in the valley. On the property's last open day as a family-run demonstration site, 400 people came, not to see a ruined farm, but to walk across 4 decades of restored floodplain and ask the new owners to leave it standing. The company agreed to leave the river flats untouched and committed to studying the techniques Andrews had spent his life defending. His son Stuart now runs a training program built on what was learned there, teaching a new generation of landholders the same starting idea, that the plants along a dying waterway may not be the problem. What Andrews got exactly right or wrong in the details is still being tested by scientists today, and that's a normal, healthy part of how land science works. What's harder to argue with is the image 400 people walked across on that last open day, a valley that was salt-poisoned and eroding in the mid-1970s, still green, still holding water, close to 50 years after one farmer decided the weeds everyone told him to kill were the only reason the land could survive at all. If a story like this changed how you think about what a weed is actually doing to a struggling piece of land, subscribe. One of these goes up every week. Like the video if it was worth your time.